All right, welcome everyone. I see a few people are starting to trickle in for today's webinar. As you are settling in and getting comfortable, I'm going to throw a quick poll question up because we would love to know what brought you to this webinar today. A couple of the options here. So maybe you're looking for an educational experience, learning a little bit more about GRC. Maybe this is project research. You have an upcoming third-party risk management project. This is a great place to be if that is the case. If you're not sure why you're here and you're confused, maybe you want to stay, you might learn something. And then maybe you're also a prevalent customer and you're staying up to date with what's going on. So take a moment, answer a poll question when you get a chance. My name is Amy Tweed. I'm in business development here at Prevalent. You'll see two other faces I am joined by here with Michael Rasmussen. He is a GRC expert of GRC 2020, and he'll be taking us through this webinar today, all about managing third-party ESG risk across the extended enterprise. So great place to be. You'll also see Scott Lang. He is Prevalent's own VP of Product Marketing, who will answer any questions you may have about Prevalent itself and explain a little bit more about what we're doing over here. You will see there's the Q&A function and the chat function at the bottom of the screen. So if you do have any questions throughout the webinar, please type them out for us. This is a really good chance to get your questions answered by a GRC expert and a Prevalent expert as well. Also, this is being recorded. So if you have to hop off halfway between, whatever it may be, this will be sent to your inbox first thing tomorrow. We really do want this to be interactive. So please use the chat and Q&A function as you are on mute and cameras are off. All right, so without further ado, I will hand this over to Michael. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, and yourself?
Good, thank you so much for asking. It's all yours.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here today and talking about one of the critical topics of our day, environmental social governance, ESG risk, not just within the organization, but across the extended enterprise. As I stated in many of my presentations and research, if we take the English poet John Donne, who said, "No man is an island entire of himself," and apply it to the world of business today, no corporation is an island entire of itself. Every corporation is a part of the continent and a part of the main. It is an interconnected world, and your organization is dependent upon an array of third-party relationships, what we call the extended enterprise. It could be vendors, suppliers, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, brokers, agents, dealers, intermediaries, and more. In fact, in one large global automobile manufacturer that's restructuring their risk and third-party program, I was talking to them, and their whole point was that our business is not defined by brick and mortar walls and traditional employees. Our business is the extended enterprise. When we're not in lockdowns and you're in the corporate offices and you walk down the halls and sit in meetings, half the people you encounter aren't traditional employees. They are the outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, and temporary workers, and more. And our businesses are dependent upon them. But how do we go about addressing the values and commitments of the organizations in context of environmental social governance, ESG risk across the extended enterprise? This is a very hot topic right now. ESG is getting pressure from a lot of different areas of the organization. Before, we called it corporate social responsibility or sustainability. But the difference is that CSR, corporate social responsibility, was often passed around the organization like a hot potato, and it often ended in the lap of marketing, became a branding exercise and not really a compliance and integrity exercise. The ESG is different because it has teeth. ESG has teeth from the investors. Companies like BlackRock and State Street are making investment decisions in companies based on ESG practices. Boards of directors are being voted out or voted in, individual board members, by ESG metrics. You've got regulations popping up from in the financial services space here in the US at the Federal Reserve, focus on the environment and banks having to manage the impact of climate change on their assets and portfolio. Same thing across Europe. You've got a history of different regulations out there, from bribery and corruption, US Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, UK Bribery Act, SEP and DO in France, to UK Modern Slavery Act, to California's Transparency in Supply Chains Act, to conflict minerals and more. But now you've got significant legislation and regulation happening that has teeth. You got a new EU directive that should be passed soon. where every country member is going to have to pass laws on corporation due diligence across the extended enterprise, extensive corporation due diligence. Germany's already ahead of the game. They passed their Corporations Due Diligence Act. And if you pretty much have any presence in Germany, whether you're a company headquartered there, or you have operations there, or you even are a supplier for third party in a supply chain for German companies, it's going to impact you. It's going to have a bigger impact than GDPR did globally. It's absolutely huge. The extent of due diligence that has to go on in the third party enterprise, extended enterprise, across ESG areas, environmental, social governance. We're going to get into this. I can keep going on and on. You know, your employees are making decisions on ESG. Are they going to work for you, for this company? You know, it's more than just salary and benefits, but do you share the same values as they do? Customers are making ESG decisions. ESG is critical to the organization. And in that context, it's critical to the extended enterprise because the organization is really defined by the extended enterprise. You have the old phrase, I can tell you who you are by who your friends are. The same thing in the business. I can identify your business and your values by your business relationships. And so in that context, today we're going to talk about managing third-party ESG risk across the extended enterprise. Let's go back to December 2019. It's interesting because I wrote a blog in December 2019, taking a spin off Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. I called it A Tale of Two Futures. Is our future a Blade Runner future, or is it a Star Trek future? I'm a science fiction fan, so I love science fiction movies. So Blade Runner, Star Trek are great analogies. I'm looking forward to Friday when the first episode of the Isaac Asimov Foundations comes out on Apple. But you know, science fiction, where are we headed towards in our future? What does our future look like? Are we headed towards that dystopia of Blade Runner, where it's an environmental and social disaster? Or are we headed towards that, what is generally a cooperative, socially and intergalactic, racially, you know, cooperative for the most part, an environmentally green and friendly future of Star Trek? Obviously, there's tensions in Star Trek because you have to have a story. But if you contrast the worlds of Blade Runner and Star Trek, they are very different, even though both involve Earth. But which one are we headed towards? And I said in this blog that the decisions companies make today are going to impact if we're heading towards a Blade Runner or a Star Trek future. And what's interesting is I wrote this blog in December 2019. It's become one of my most popular blog articles I ever wrote. And in that context, it was just about 2 months before COVID-19 lockdowns and the significant impact of COVID-19. And one of the things I stated in that blog was that organizations' risk management programs are going to have to fundamentally change. Because if you looked at their risk management programs, you would think that 80% of their risk is IT risk. And IT risk is absolutely huge. I know there's a lot of IT security professionals on the call today. I started my career in IT securities in the 90s. I mean, I was number 3695 for a CISSP, and I still have. I understand information security, but it's not our only risk. We have environmental risks, we have health and safety risks. And I mentioned that if you look at the World Economic Forum global risk reports and you contrast the global risk that the world faces, and you look at organizations, you know, risk registers, they don't line up. And I stated, you know, organizations need to restructure their risk management programs and properly address health and safety risks like pandemics and environment risk like climate change. And then COVID-19 comes 2 months later after my blog and proves my point. You know, a tale of two futures. Now, the other challenging piece of all this is that the organization is very dynamic. You know, it's changing minute by minute and second by second. Regulations are changing. Just in financial services, you know, you have 257 regulatory change events every business day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. You know, every business day, 52 weeks out of the world, there's on average 257 regulatory change events coming from just over 1,200 regulators around the world. And you have to keep up with all that regulatory change. And that regulatory change doesn't just impact your organization, but it impacts your extended enterprise. As a lot of those outsourcers and service providers and contractors, consultants, temporary workers, and more have to address those same type of regulations and be compliant as well. But you know, there's lots of regulatory change, there's lots of risk change, but the business itself is changing. It's processes and transactions and employees, but it's third parties are changing. And we might be changing outsourcers and suppliers and vendors, but even the ones we keep, their businesses are changing. They might have been the right vendor to do business with 3 years ago, but are they the right vendor today? Do they have the right security controls in place? Do they have the right social accountability program in place to deal with child labor, forced labor, modern slavery issues? We have to navigate chaos in the extended enterprise of third-party relationships and deal with a very changing regulatory environment, risk environment, business environment, and the changing extended enterprise environment, and keep all this change in sync. The physicist Fritjof Capra stated it so well. The more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. It's an interconnected risk world in the context of third-party risk. What starts off with a pandemic, with the COVID-19, say that's that orange thread up there. You have health and safety risk, not just within our organization, but within our supply chain. And that brings in that yellow thread there, a resiliency risk. Are our suppliers, vendors, outsourcers, and service providers going to be able to deliver during this pandemic? That brings in that, brown thread, that there's greater risk of modern slavery issues because factories in our supply chain might be shutting down and there might be turning back on with child labor and forced labor because the factory has been devastated by illness in the pandemic, and so they're staffing child labor and forced labor. So we have increased modern slavery risk. Then we have that black thread coming in. That could be bribery and corruption risk. If you think about it, import and export is very slow. There's backlogs in shipping. There's limited government contracts and procurement. Customs is overloaded. And so in this context, there's greater risk that somebody might bribe a foreign government official to expedite their goods through customs, go beyond what might be a facilitated payment and so forth, or to get that government contract or whatever it might be. And most bribery and corruption risks, like U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, involves the third parties. Then you've got that green risk thread coming in, and that could be IT security risk in your third-party relationships. And we've seen things like solar winds and so much more in this area just within the last year. But in that context, even the home office environment, you're working from home and you might be an employee of your organization, but you know what? Your third parties are working from home too. Those outsourcers and service providers and contractors and consultants, and their home office might not be secure. You look around me and my TV is connected to the internet, my speaker's connected to the internet, my wall outlets are connected to the internet, my blender in my kitchen's connected to the internet. I can program with my iPhone. I have no idea why I would want to, but I could. If any of these devices had a backdoor Trojan horse, it could, like, think solar winds, for example, they are real. It can compromise my home office, my equipment. And I'm a contractor, consultant, advisor for a lot of different companies, and it could compromise their data that I have and the connections I have to their networks. Yeah, and so I can go on and on about this interconnected risk environment, where the physicist was talking about where the physicist Fritjof Capra was talking about biological ecosystems in this quote. The quote applies perfectly to the extended enterprise risk of today. It is an interconnected risk environment, and a lot of organizations are having to realize, how do we get full situational awareness of risk, 360-degree contextual intelligence of risk in any given relationship? Because what if IT security scores that risk as a yellow, using a simple stoplight diagram for simplicity here? And maybe bribery, the compliance group looking at bribery and corruption scores it as a yellow. And procurement looking at financial viability scores it as a yellow. And somebody else like the environment group scores it as a yellow, or health and safety. Do we have enough yellows that the aggregate risk exposure is actually a red? We have to be able to see all these risk relationships and how they interconnect with each other. So we're moving from a past to a future. We're moving from a past where we had a lot of silos for third-party risk program, where IT security is doing its thing and procurement's doing its thing and corporate compliance and ethics is doing its thing and business continuity resiliency is doing its thing in third-party relationships, to a future of getting these different departments to work together and a common strategy, process, as well as information technology architecture. We're moving from a past where there's accountability for third-party risk that was often passed around a path where there's responsibility, because responsibilities you can give to somebody else, but accountability you can't. You're actually accountable. That's the future, is greater accountability in this area. We're seeing a past that focused on a lot of corporate social responsibilities that became a branding exercise, to a future that's focused on ESG, environmental social governance. So I've set the stage here. Let's get into ESG and its impact on the extended enterprise. So ESG, environment, social governance. It means different things to different people. It means different things to different industries. An ESG program in a bank is going to look different from an ESG program in a petroleum company or a mining company, because there's different types of ESG risks that go in there. You can't, it's just not a cookie cutter program. It has to fit your organization's size, jurisdictions, and industry. And we focus on the elements of ESG, the environment, social, and governance, and we pay different attention to those based on our experience and focus. But there's so much to unpack and understand in defining what ESG is, the environmental social governance. But I often find it's very much like the fable of the blind man and the elephant, where one blind man, per person, I should say today, touches the trunk and says, "Oh, it's a tree." Another blind man touches the tail and says, "Oh, it's a rope." Another blind person touches the side of the elephant, and says it's a wall. I find that this is what happens with ESG when I start talking to organizations. That somebody that works in the environment side and climate change, they think it's all about the environment. It's about the E in ESG, and they forget about the S and the G. Somebody focus on diversity and inclusivity and things like that, the human rights aspects, they think it's about the S, and they focus on that. And then the governance piece is very broad and includes internal control management, company structure, reporting, bribery and corruption, and money laundering and fraud and IT security. And different aspects, we'll look at different aspects of the G and think it's about them. And really, ESG is about all those different elements. And I'm going to unpack that in just a few minutes here. But what's really important to understand here is that we need to address ESG-RC. And so my point here is that we have when we look at ESG and what we call GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance, these two belong together and they work together. ESG is about the reporting and the integrity of the organization. And so in that context, there's a lot of standards out there, like the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, that tells you, here's the framework for reports and what needs to go into a report on ESG or something like ESG. And there's a lot of different initiatives out there to tell you the reporting structure, but it doesn't tell you how to manage those processes to build those reports and to ensure those reports are active, are correct. And so ESG needs GRC, and so I'm calling it ESGRC. And the GRC brings the practical processes of achieving ESG within our organization, but also across the extended enterprise. And we'll unpack this more as we go into the next few slides. But today's organization needs to be able to see the tree as well as the forest, that individual ESG risk, as well as the interconnectedness of ESG risks in the organization. But it's more than just the tree and the forest. It also gets down to the leaves and the branches. We have to see a lot of details. That we can't just manage a vendor or supplier. Let's pick a supplier based on the overall relationship. We have to even get down to the facility levels. For example, I sat on the Social Accountability Advisory Board for a major global Fortune brand. And in this context, they have 5,000 suppliers with 20,000 facilities. They measure risk at the supplier level, those 5,000 suppliers. That can be the tree, the individual ESG risk. And again, this is social accountability. So it's this particular function that I was working with was dealing with the S in ESG, dealing with supply chain code of conduct, child labor, forced labor, working hours, health and safety of the supply chain in the facilities. And so if the supplier relationship is that tree, they are monitoring that risk and scoring that risk for the overall supplier relationship. But it's also about the leaves and the branches, because they actually score the risk at the facility level. One supplier might have one facility, another supplier for them might have 50 facilities. And they didn't just score the risk at the relationship level for the supplier, but each of the facility levels. They'd go out and do on-site audits and inspections, have annual questionnaires, surveys, assessments, and attestation to supply chain code of conduct at each facility, not just the supplier level. So when we manage ESG type risk and other risks in the extended enterprise, we have to get down to the details of the relationship. It's not just the tree, but it could be the leaves and the branches. If it's not a supply chain relationship, like an outsourcer or a service provider, you might have 100 different contracts, or maybe a dozen different data centers being outsourced to somebody. And you need to know that how many of those like touch GDPR and EU citizen data, things like that. You have to get down into the details. So what's all covered in ESG, the environmental, social, and governance? When we unpack the environment piece, obviously we have things like climate change and carbon emissions, things like that. You have the use of natural resources and pollution and waste, air, water, waste, hazards, things like that. And being able to look for new opportunities to expand the organization's green footprint and achieve new ways of manufacturing and distribution and things that are more environmentally friendly. And so there's a lot of things that come into the E in ESG. And since the E leads the acronym, I find a lot of organizations are naturally focused on the E, but the S and the G are every bit as important as the E to the organization. When you unpack the S, you're dealing with things like child labor, forced labor, like prison labor, socioeconomic inequality, diversity and inclusion, working conditions, health and safety, privacy and digital rights to information. Privacy to me falls under the S, not the G. Privacy is about personal information, personally identifiable information. In some countries of the world or regions of the world, like Europe, for example, they have greater control and access, the individual does, to their information. And so I would say privacy is in the S, not the G. Information security is in the G, and there's a relationship between the two, but privacy is firmly under the S from my point of view. Product liability, stakeholder opposition, looking for social opportunities, ways to brand and engage the organization to be a more socially accountable and friendly organization, not just within the organization, but across its extended enterprise. Going back to the E for a second, I can remember an inquiry a few years back from a global financial services firm, a large financial services firm. And they had a big push on green IT, that we're going to address environmentally friendly data centers and make a big push that our operations are friendly and green. And the big thing they came up with is, if we're really going to do this and put our brand on this, we've got to address our extended enterprise and third-party relationships. In that context, we have to ensure that our outsourcers and service providers, because we outsource our data centers to other firms, that they're following those green principles and practices, because we can't just brand the organization that we have a green IT strategy if all of our outsourced IT isn't following that. And so it impacted their third-party relationships. Under the S, the social, I already mentioned that global fortune brand, dealing with social accountability in this area, across these areas of child labor, forced labor, harassment, discrimination, working conditions, health and safety, we're all part of that. But so we looked at the E and we looked at the S. Now let's unpack the G. The G is the most complex one because it covers so many different things. It includes the corporate governance of the organization, as well as its third parties, fraud, internal controls, bribery and corruption. And if you look at most enforcement actions on U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and other country bribery and corruption legislation, most of those enforcement actions involve a third party of some type. Anti-bribery and corruption. It involves anti-money laundering, information security, again, not just within our organization, but across our third-party relationships as well. Corporate behavior like conduct, anti-competitive practices, tax transparency, and ownership and structure. There's a lot to these elements that we just unpacked. In the environment, looking at climate change and natural resources, pollution and waste. The social, looking at child labor, forced labor, socioeconomic inequality, diversity, inclusion, working conditions, health and safety, privacy, and more. To the very complex and intricate world of governance that includes things like information security, to fraud, to bribery and corruption, internal controls, and more. So what does this mean? It means we have a lot of different departments that have to work together. There is no such thing as one single ESG department. There's a lot of departments in the organization that need to function and collaboratively work together to develop an ESG strategy, not just internally, but for the extended enterprise. Now, in my experience, most of the time, ESG, as far as the executive leading it, is now being the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. And I've been stating for, over 15 years that the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer really is the Chief Integrity Officer. But the acronym's already taken by the Chief Information Officer, the CIO. But to me, that's what the CECO really is. The Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer is the Chief Integrity Officer of the organization. And you cannot measure the integrity of an organization today without looking at the extended enterprise. And so we need somebody that can lead this strategy. And some people are creating new departments for ESG, but others are giving it to the Corporate Compliance and Ethics Officer and in that department to be able to lead this. But we need somebody to lead it, but it is really a federated activity with a lot of other departments that need to be involved, because we do have the environmental group, the health and safety group, we've got procurement, we've got IT security, we've got internal controls, we've got corporate compliance and ethics with bribery and corruption, we have privacy and the Chief Privacy and Data Protection Officer. They all have a stake in the game. And to have an ESG strategy and reporting that is consistent and cohesive means that these different departments, even that are spread out in different areas of the organization and in the organizational structure, these different departments need to work together collaboratively in a common strategy with a common process and technology. But we need to define who's accountable. That was the problem with corporate social responsibility before we had ESG. Is corporate social responsibility was a great idea, but it didn't have the teeth of ESG and the enforcement and the stakeholder pressure. And it ended up being passed around the organization, and marketing often ran with it as a marketing exercise. And that's what happens when you have responsibility and not accountability. Accountability means this person owns it. They can outsource responsibilities to other people, but if there's an issue, that person has to answer for it. A critical thing in ESG across the extended enterprise is finding out who's accountable for it. Now, in some jurisdictions and industries, accountability is actually going into regulation. We're seeing this being established indirectly through fines and penalties, and so some executives having to step up with what we're seeing with the German law, Corporations Due Diligence Act. But you look at even the United Kingdom's SMCR, the UK's Senior Manager and Certification Regime. Now, this is much broader than the extended enterprise, much broader than ESG, but it impacts both. And in that context, UK SMCR requires that you have 28 different senior management functions that have to be clearly defined. One of them is about third-party vendor risk. Another one is about environmental risk on the bank and managing the environmental impact on the portfolio and climate change. Both these touch on ESG. And if there's willful misconduct, willful wrongdoing, that senior management function could go to jail. If there is negligence or lack of due diligence, that senior management function can be personally fined on an individual level, not just the banks. And so you're seeing accountability in some areas of the world that's directly impacting third-party extended enterprise and ESG, like within financial services with UK SMCR. Now we need to develop a top-down approach that brings all of this together. That involves a cohesive management strategy that brings the different departments together, clearly defines who's in charge of the ESG strategy, but what are the other different departments that work in this? And this is awfully defined in a charter for these groups to work together across different functions and areas of the business into that strategy. That strategy needs to clearly articulate the extended enterprise. because ESG means nothing if you're not dealing with the extended enterprise. And that's why you have the EU directive and Germany's Corporations Due Diligence Act, because they clearly recognize that. I mean, the German Corporations Due Diligence Act is all built around those elements of an E, S, and G, and doing extensive due diligence in your third-party relationships out there and across the organization. And so in that context, you cannot develop an ESG management strategy from my perspective that does not include the extended enterprise. There, you also need to define the ESG management processes. What's the due diligence processes for onboarding third parties, for assessing third parties in the extended enterprise, for monitoring that and reevaluating that, and even offboarding third parties? What are those processes? What's the ESG management process internally for gathering information, reporting to the stakeholders, like in a GRI framework or SASB? And what's the information technology architecture needed to manage ESG internally, but also across the extended enterprise? And how do that technology work together cohesively to be able to address this in the organization? These are all extremely critical elements. So the question I have before you today, what is your approach to ESG management? A lot of you're just trying to put this together because this is the hot topic of the year. You know, a year ago, you may not even have heard of ESG, certainly not probably 5 years ago. These are things you're having to react to now, but it's coming quickly. So a lot of you might be that distributed approach where there's disconnected departments managing different aspects of ESG, like social accountability in one group, and privacy and IT security in another group, and bribery and corruption in another group, and in different ways with little or no collaboration with other departments that fails to really cohesively manage it in the extended enterprise and deliver on ESG reporting. But what we should be building towards is this future of a federated ESG management, where there's central accountability, that there's some executive like the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer that's responsible for ESG overall, but there's different departments that plug into the strategy that work together in a federated manner, where there's an integrated approach that balances ESG management, centralization, and with distributed participation and collaboration. So as you develop your strategy, here are some key questions to be pondering and think about. What are the strategic business and regulatory drivers for ESG in your organization? Again, that's going to vary by size of organization, geography, but particularly industry. You know, ESG, like in a mining company, looks different from ESG in a bank. And so we need to be able to apply what does ESG look like within our organization, our context, and what is the strategic business and regulatory drivers for our industry and our context. What are the top ESG risks and emerging risks facing your organization? Is it social accountability issues, privacy and security issues? Is it bribery and corruption? Is it environment? It's obviously a combination of a lot of these, but what are the top ones? What's the most critical for your organization? Again, a lot of that's going to be profiles by the industry as well. What ESG risks could derail your business strategy, your reputation and brand, and tarnish your company's good name? You know what can happen overnight is the destruction of a company's brand. A company's brand can be completely destroyed by one bad incident. So a company's brand can tank sharply, nosedive, but it can take years and years to repair. I mean, good night. Nike's still trying to work on addressing the child labor issues from decades ago. And just when people talk about child labor, the brand Nike just comes up. You know, it takes years to repair these things. Process improvements and visibility. What is the process to manage ESG today? A lot of you have already been doing something like this in the organization. There's been silos dealing with bribery and corruption and IT security and privacy, like in the extended enterprise in silos, but you haven't brought it all together yet. Others, you've had programs like corporate social responsibility, but it needs to be restructured to meet how it's evolved to ESG today. What kinds of improvements are required and being contemplated for ESG? What distinctive competence can be gained by optimizing ESG in your organization? How will an ESG program help the organization improve business performance? How will an ESG program gain visibility into risks across business units and functions and areas and the extended enterprise? And the governance team and collaboration. Who are the current executive sponsors for ESG? How are they engaged to work collaboratively? What culturally and organizationally need to change to meet your ESG vision? What kinds of skill sets are required? Maybe there's areas of ESG that we haven't really focused on, like the environment. We need to bring in skill sets there. Whether stakeholders could or should be driving the program, and what do you expect to get out of the program? The overall process for managing ESG in the extended enterprise of third-party relationships is before you in these 7 steps. It first starts with establishing the ESG accountability and reporting structures for the extended enterprise. How are we going to measure, what are we going to measure the third parties around? And different third parties have different ESG risks. How do we categorize, risk rank them, and score them? Who's in charge of the ESG in a third-party extended enterprise context? And what are we going to report on, and who are we going to report to? That's step 1. Step 2 is developing your policies and processes. It's going to start with your supply chain or vendor code of conduct. And that's going to probably need to be revised to address all the different ESG domains as well as regulatory areas. But there's a wealth of other supporting policies like privacy policies, IT security policies, bribery and corruption policies, environmental policies, social accountability policies, and more for third parties that might play into that vendor and supply chain code of conduct. And so step 2 is developing the policies, processes, and controls. Step 3 is to be able to communicate and train those third parties on the vendor supply chain code of conduct and other ESG related policies and processes in the third party context. And from there, step 4 is to regularly assess through surveys and questionnaires. And at some points in high risk areas, on-site audits and inspections might be required of facilities and third party relationships. But we need to be able to assess things. And there we need to be able to monitor the ESG key performance indicators and key risk indicators overall for our ESG program, for the ESG KPIs and KRIs for the extended enterprise, but then also for each third-party relationship, monitoring their ESG scores as well. And from there, we report, engage, and when we have issues on ESG, we remediate them. But it all means that we're looking for effective governance and oversight. Again, I was talking about the ESGRC and bringing these worlds together to be able to see, you leverage governance, risk, and compliance processes like what we find in the OSEC GRC capability model, leverage and use those for an ESG purpose for overall reporting. And so we need effective oversight that manages the ethics and integrity of ESG across the organization through an integrated GRC strategy. So as you build this strategy, here are some key messages and things that need to be clearly in place. First off, as part of the strategy, what it is and why. The organization, whatever your organization's name is striving to establish a distinctive competence and trust and best-in-class ESG program. This will enable the organization to treat environmental social governance more proactively and move with agility in the industry and a dynamic and chaotic world. To do this, the ESG group will develop a culture of ESG with a focus on accountability, metrics, and reporting, not only in the organization, but across the extended enterprise. As a result, the ESG program will enable intelligence through people, process, and technology initiatives to engage internally and in the extended enterprise. The ESG program is focused on delivering value by aggregating ESG metrics for risk and correlating core risk elements. We are concentrating our ESG competency expertise in 5 ESG focus areas. This is an example here. You might have 10, you might have 3. Aligning by ESG focus areas allows us to work more strategically across our stakeholder groups. What this means to our stakeholder community, our key ESG focus areas allow us to evolve from ESG risk identification through analytics to ongoing ESG intelligence in our extended enterprise. Number 1, we'll leverage working groups in ESG policy, risk, and compliance through active governance model, not just internally, but in our third-party relationships. Number 2, we'll focus on ESG risk analytics to develop a common risk ontology. Number 3, we'll focus on ESG risk and control management to ensure best practice ESG compliance is implemented. Again, not just internally, but in the extended enterprise. Number 4, we'll focus on integrated ESG reporting and information through active dashboards and stakeholders. Number 5, we'll build a strong technology foundation. What this means to you, this is a collaborative process between stakeholders and the ESG team focused on value-based initiatives. Together, we analyze each process to determine where it can be best aligned and integrated with ESG themes and values. Together, we'll create more relevant ESG value equations. And then what to expect going forward. Working together, we're going to build, and define an ESG risk ontology and end-to-end process to integrate findings, risk, and remediation. Again, not just internally, but across external enterprise. Future transition points. By this date, we want to do this. By this date, we want to do this. Eventually, we want to be very intelligent about ESG risk intelligence. We're going to look for opportunities to integrate new processes and technology into the ESG program, participate in value-based models, provide on-demand ESG training and improvements, not just internally, but also to the extended enterprise, and reporting. So how do we get there? How do you build an ESG strategy for the extended enterprise? First off, you need to understand where you're at today and where do you want to be 2 years from now. I think you should be building a 2-year strategy. ESG is moving too quickly and evolving to create a 3-year strategy or a 5-year strategy. So where are you at today and where do you want to be at 2 years from now? And how are you going to get there? What's the roadmap that will see you through to get you there? You're doing something in some place today already. Most likely it's in different silos that aren't working together. Because if you go back to those slides that I had, back here, the environment, the social, the governance, there's a lot of things happening in the organization, the extended enterprise in those areas. Many of you on the phone might be working in the IT security and privacy in the extended enterprise. Others of you on the phone might be working in bribery and corruption, like U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the extended enterprise. And so others might be working on social accountability and modern slavery issues. So you most likely somewhere in your organizations, you're doing aspects of ESG in the extended enterprise already. What's being done there? How's it being done? What's working? What's not working? That's all defining your current state. From there, you can define your future state. Where do you want it to be in 2 years? What does it look like? Who's in charge? What's the overall structure of the program? What departments are involved? How do they work together? Be a visionary and design the ideal ESG and the extended enterprise strategy for your organization. Design that and say, that's our goal 2 years from now. Here's where we're at today. What are the changes that need to be in place? And how are we going to address those changes? And what sequence and order to get there within 2 years? From there, conditioning is critical. You want to make sure your team is ready. Again, there's a lot of departments to be involved. First off, who's going to lead the extended enterprise portion of the ESG strategy? Is it procurement? Is it corporate compliance and ethics? Is it some other department? But what other departments need to be involved? How are they going to work together? What needs to be in place to get them to work together? How do we develop a common vision and get the other departments on board and excited and engaged and willing to be part of this and not just holding us back and digging their heels in? We need to develop that clear message of value and why this is important and get these departments functioning, working together as a team, even though they have different areas of responsibility and accountability in the organization. From there, what's critical is selecting the right equipment for the journey. It doesn't work very well when you go to climb up a mountain and you find out you only have enough equipment to get you up halfway. And then you got to climb all the way back down and get more equipment. And by that point, you're absolutely exhausted that you can't do the climb again. Or if you do, you fall and there's a fatality. You want to make sure that you're starting with the right ESG extended enterprise foundation. What solution is highly agile that can not only deliver on your needs today, but can actually deliver on what you're designing for that ESG and the extended enterprise program 2 years from now? And so that's absolutely critical, is making sure you have the right information and technology architecture in place as you start this journey, because nothing destroys a project quicker than finding out that 6 months into it, we got to go back and do an RFP because what we're building on isn't going to deliver. You need to make sure you have the right information technology architecture, particularly for the extended enterprise, that can build and deliver on what you're looking for 2 years from now. Because if you get halfway through and find out that you got to start over, it's not going to go well. That's how projects die and fail. The other thing that where projects die and fail is taking on too much too quickly. A good ESG journey is done with not with one effort. You're not get this done in 30 days. I mentioned trying 2 years. Maybe you have to extend it to 3 years. But you know, you're not going to do all this like when in a month. It's just not going to work, particularly for any organization that has a number of relationships and is of a good size. If you climb Mount Everest too quickly, what happens? What happens is you die. You know, your body literally has to get to the first base camp on Mount Everest, and it has to acclimate to the altitude before it's ready to get to the next base camp, and before it's ready to get to the next level and the next level. The same thing with a big ESG project, because there's a lot of different areas of ESG. And we need to figure out, what are we tackling first? Well, we need to build the foundation and then select the right technology architecture and build the ESG team and strategy. And then for the first 3 months, maybe we're going to be focused on social accountability issues in the extended enterprise and supply chain. And then after that, we're going to tackle the privacy and information security issues and things like that. After that, we might look at the environment aspects. And we need to build that strategy out to be able to develop this over time. From there, your journey is never over. Once complete is not over, you begin preparing for the next project. You know, for the last 18 months, we've been dealing with COVID-19 and the pandemic, which definitely has ESG ramifications. I went through a lot of those. You know, it starts out with the pandemic, has had impacts on the extended enterprise, in an ESG context, on the health and safety of this extended enterprise, child labor, forced labor, bribery and corruption, information security. We went through all that. And so for the last 18 months, we've been dealing with that. Who knows? 2022, maybe the world will be destroyed by the Vogon constructor ships making way for a hyperspace intergalactic bypass. For you Douglas Adams fans, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We don't know what the future is going to hold. And so we need to, that's what's exciting about managing GRC broadly, managing ESG broadly, but also in the extended enterprise. It's a very dynamic world. It's not static. We have to adapt to changing regulations, mergers and acquisitions, to world events and things. And we have to constantly adapt and change our program to address a different cultural climate continuously in the organization and around the world. So the benefits of an ESG strategy for the extended enterprise brings 360-degree contextual awareness. Awareness that we can see that integrated view of risk across those different risk domains, where we don't have silos looking at IT security separately from bribery and corruption, separately from health and safety, separately from modern slavery of the supply chain. But we can see the big picture and how these risks intersect and interrelate, because they do interconnect, like COVID-19 example that I mentioned. And the quote from Fritjof Capra, the physicist, that say, the more we study the major problems of our times, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are interconnected and interdependent. Your third-party risks are interconnected and interdependent. These ESG risks and third-party relationships are interconnected and interdependent. We need to be able to have a program that can address them to bring greater awareness, contextual awareness. This allows us to align our different departments and functions to work together, to be more responsive, to be able to address a dynamic environment, understand it, being intelligent about it, to be more responsive to change, which allows us to be agile. Agile is the ability to navigate the environment so we don't have events and issues. But it also brings in resiliency, so that when we do have an ESG or other event in a third-party relationship, we can spring back quickly. We can be operationally resilient and spring back quickly, recover from that event. We also want to do this in a way that is highly efficient in our use of human capital and financial capital resources. The benefits of 360-degree contextual awareness of an ESG strategy in the extended enterprise. I have left 10 minutes here for Q&A time, and we'll turn this over to Amy. Are you leading the Q&A time?
Yes, I'll bring it to Scott though first. I think Scott has a few things he wants to say, and then we can move into the Q&A.
Sounds good.
Yeah, that's right. Michael, I'll share my screen if you don't have any more slides to share there. I've got a couple things I'd like to share. Michael, if you want to, yeah, if you want to stop sharing.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. I thought you could take it from me. Sorry. There you go.
Sorry. No worries. No worries at all. All right. Let me share my screen there. Apologies for the delay, folks. Awesome. Well, if you guys can see my screen, I just want to walk through a couple brief moments of what Prevalent can do to help kind of fulfill what Michael talked about during his presentation. And before I start, I just want to say I am super jazzed about a couple of sci-fi series now. So Michael, thank you for turning me on to that one you mentioned on Apple TV. It's always an education when we talk. So I want to address kind of how Prevalent addresses ESG risk amongst third parties. And from our perspective, kind of tie into something Michael said a few minutes ago, it's really no different than addressing any other type of risk in that you need to establish a picture of what you want to gather information on, put it into some sort of a framework that enables you to easily report on it, address risks, and then close those things out as they are important to your organization in risk tolerances. So, from a solution perspective, I really think you could boil what Prevalent does to help in ESG down to 5 points. Number one is, we enable you as you onboard, profile, and tier all your vendors to ask very specific questions about a company's ESG processes, procedures, policies, and more. What is your modern slavery policy? What is your stance against or for environmental sustainability and more? With very specific questionnaires that we've got built to help inform some of that very initial inherent risk scoring as you onboard the vendor. Second thing is building a comprehensive vendor profile that includes ESG ratings and scores. Our platform includes an input, a third-party input that gives an ESG rating on more than 12,000 different companies. And that helps you, again, get a good picture of, some areas you may want to drill into a little bit more, get a head start on reporting, and just give you a better picture of this particular vendor. And if they're taking, items like sustainability and social justice and equity and hiring as important as you are. Third, as I mentioned, we've got very prescriptive questionnaires built into the Prevalent platform that enable you to assess those third parties and then map the answers to a single risk register for triage and remediation. That same risk register that you're mapping additional risks to as well, whether they be cybersecurity related, private data privacy related, InfoSec, compliance related, whatever. The objective is to ask a set of questions, get everything together, and give you an overall picture, a more holistic picture of a third party's risk. But it doesn't stop there because we know third-party risk assessments can't be one and done, even though they are quite static on an annual basis. So we do quite a bit of monitoring of supplier reputation, potential sanctions, financial governance and transparency, politically exposed persons, and a couple of other related updates that continually feed into the platform that can speak to some of the S and the G with regard to ESG. We're also introducing a new U.S. Environmental Protection Agency (EPA) violations input into the vendor profile as well to address the E in ESG. And then finally, reporting against standards and regulatory requirements, where you are required to report against the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, for example. We've got some basic reporting templates to help you address some specific provisions in that regulation. The Corporate Due Diligence Act in the European Union, we're building that out now. And more. So I guess everything from onboarding to offboarding and everything in between, including the inherent risk scoring, the assessment management, and the reporting of those requirements. The Prevalent platform is built ideally to address, as ESG is another risk to manage. So we kind of talked through, the capabilities here that we offer at every one of these stages of the vendor lifecycle. I think the output is pretty clear from a benefits perspective. That unified platform that we offer addresses risks not just in ESG, but also in cybersecurity, data privacy, many other different domains as well. And a lot of folks in your organizations can benefit from it. Procurement teams, IT security teams, vendor risk management, legal compliance teams. one of the biggest values our customers see is the fact that we bring all those teams together under, one pane of glass to help address third-party risk, whether it's managing vendors to managing risk and kind of everything in between. And that's all I really wanted to share with you today, just a little bit of a commercial there at the end on what we can do to address very specific third-party risks, and how we kind of tie into the ESG story, very specific ESG capabilities, and how we can really fulfill on what Michael walked through as a good approach and strategy to address ESG risk in your organization. Great, Amy, back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Scott. That's actually perfect because one of our first questions was, how is ESG being addressed in the Prevalent platform? So I feel like you covered a lot there. And for those of you who are wondering, you can reach out to info@prevalent.net or even find me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to connect you with a product expert here. We can dig a little bit deeper. So as an option, we have one other question, but as I relay that to you both, I'm going to throw up one of our last poll questions for those of you still joining us. Are you looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the coming months? Yes, no, I'm not sure. Take a moment to answer. We are here to help, as we mentioned. So if you need any support, let us know. The other question I have for both of you, what does ESG change for third-party due diligence and risk assessment of third-party relationships?
The big thing is there might be domains that the organization is not evaluating in an ESG context within their third parties now. And the other thing is the third party relationships, I mean, there's only so much time they can spend on this. And so if you have IT security going in one direction and procurement going in a different direction and corporate compliance ethics in a different direction, your third party is going to be screaming at you. This really requires an integrated process, a common information technology architecture to be able to deliver assessments and conduct due diligence. To be able to make it consistent and an integrated fashion across these different domains.
Great, Scott, do you want to add anything to that?
No, Michael summed it up great. I mean, it's all about bringing people together, breaking down silos in enterprises and kind of unifying everybody into the same methodology, so that they're treating their third parties regardless of risk domain equally, or consistently rather.
Yeah. Great. Well, it's the only question I had from the audience. So if anyone has anything last minute for these last 3 minutes of our 60 minutes together, please let me know. But as I mentioned before, if you want more information on Prevalent or want to chat with anyone, you can find me on LinkedIn, find Prevalent on LinkedIn, add Michael as well for GRC questions or anything like that. And we are happy to help. So I hope that all of you were able to help define your roadmap for incorporating ESG into your third-party risk management program. As a reminder, this has been recorded, so it'll be into your inbox first thing tomorrow morning if you registered. Anything else from either of you before we give everyone about a couple minutes back in their day? Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Scott. Thank you, Michael. That was really educational. I'm also going to check out that new sci-fi show on Apple TV. So thank you for that recommendation. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. You have 2 minutes extra. Hope to see you all next time. Thanks for joining.
And next month is Dune. The movie Dune's coming out.
Oh, even better.
That's right.
I'm looking forward to that. I actually have read that book, so that'd be good. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.